At a time when we are speaking of the inevitability of transcending the limitations of the mind and even possessing supramental consciousness, this is the time when the whole world is echoing with one message: inquire, although you should not, because inquiry is impossible. This is the climate in which we are all speaking of this proposition, and therefore you can say how much when we speak of this great possibility, which is indispensable according to what you have seen now. If the facts of the world are what they are, if human aspiration is what it is, if evolution is what it is, and what seems therefore inevitable logically, rationally, it is at that time that we are told that all this is impossible. Now let us read. I will not conclude further. Thus the eternal paradox and eternal truths of our divine life in an animal body, an immortal aspiration or reality inhabiting a mortal tenement, a single and universal consciousness representing itself in limited minds and divided egos, a transcendent, indefinable, timeless and spaceless being who alone renders time and space and cosmos possible. And in all these the higher truth realizable by the lower term justify themselves to the deliberate reason as well as to the persistent instinct or intuition of mankind. Attempts are sometimes made to have done finally with questionings which have so often been declared insoluble by logical thought, and to persuade them to limit their mental activities to the practical and immediate problems of their material existence in the universe. But such evasions are never permanent in their effect. Mankind returns from them with a more vehement impulse of inquiry or a more violent hunger for an immediate solution. By that hunger, mysticism profits and new religions arise to replace the old that have been destroyed or stripped of significance by a skepticism which itself could not satisfy, because although its business was inquiry, it was unwilling sufficiently to inquire. The attempt to deny or stifle a truth because it is yet obscure in its outward workings and too often represented by obscurantist superstition or a crude faith is itself a kind of obscurantism. The will to escape from a cosmic necessity, because it is arduous, difficult to justify by immediate tangible results, slow in regulating its operations, must turn out eventually to have been no acceptance of the truth of nature, but a revolt against the secret, mightier will of the Great Mother. It is better and more rational to accept what she will not allow us as a race to reject, and lift it from the sphere of blind instinct, obscure intuition, and random aspiration into the light of reason and an instructed and consciously self-guiding will. And if there is any higher light of illumined intuition or self-revealing truths which is now in man either obstructed or inoperative, or works with intermittent glancings as if from behind it veil, or with occasional displays as of the northern lights in our Maurya skies, then there also we need not fear to aspire. For it is likely that such is the next higher state of consciousness, of which mind is only a form and veil, and through the splendors of that light may lie the paths of our progressive self-enlargement into whatever higher state is humanity's ultimate resting place. So having considered therefore all these negative ideas which are at present, Aurobindo concludes that these negative voices are actually a revolt against a greater effort which we are required to make. If you examine all these movements which I have described just now, there is a fatigue in all these movements. Each one says, limit yourself to this. Why? Because a greater effort is needed to transcend the limitations. It says, limit yourself to this. Where you are, you can't do more than what you are doing. At the most, you can refine it a little more. Because a greater effort is required. And that greater effort is denied, is refused. And Aurobindo says, this is an address to mankind. That evolution will put you aside if you refuse. Because evolution is an inevitable force. You cannot stop evolution. It's not in your hands. Evolution is a huge, vast fact by itself. And if evolution is a fact as we have examined it as a fact, there is a demand to transcend the mind. It is true that transcendence of mind is very difficult. You might say almost impossible. But it is that effort which is demanded of man. Therefore, Aurobindo says, you must therefore receive this call of making a tremendous effort. Be ready for it. If you don't do it, you can amuse yourself for a little while. Fortunately, in mankind, there are many other movements also. As a result of the Second World War, mankind did come to a conclusion that we must make a tremendous effort to eliminate war in the world. Tremendous. It's impossible. Man is a warring animal. And to demand from man that he should now not be engaged in a war is a tremendous demand made on mankind. United Nations Organization is a sign that mankind made ultimately a tremendous effort. It did not listen to these philosophers who said we can try and we can amuse ourselves, we can do interpretation the way in which you like. These leaders said, you remain where you are, think about what you are thinking. We don't want war. Because the way in which you are thinking, war is inevitable. So, you remain where you are, we are going ahead. Take for example, educationists, parents. They want the best for the children. And their answer to all these philosophers is, you do what you like, amuse yourselves with your inquiry and no inquiry. I want the highest welfare of my children. And we have found that without education in values, without spiritual education, it's not going to happen. Whether spirituality exists or not, whether you approve of it or not, whether you want it or not, we want spirituality and education. This is the demand of the highest thought. When you see UNESCO speaking of learning to be, what is learning to be? It is to know, to possess and to be the divine. Why UNESCO in 1972 declares this book, Learning to Be? It's a demand of evolution. You may not believe in being. You may say that being is angst and anxiety and all that. But you cannot remain confined to anxiety and this kind of angst. Ultimately, you've got to overcome it. In 1990 again, UNESCO brought out another book and said, Learning Treasure Within. Why treasure within? Why does it say, look within, there is a treasure? Why UNESCO was obliged to bring out this kind of volume? So there are movements today which want to defy this kind of pragmatism, this kind of woolly thought, and this kind of pragmatism, logical analysis, which means no analysis ultimately. Transcending the limits of all these, there is a tremendous movement of evolution demanding from mankind to evolve. And Aurobindo says, do not be guided by obscurantism. If you have decided to inquire thoroughly. Don't come in the middle and say, now we don't want to inquire further. Don't be guided by instinct. Don't be guided by obscure thoughts. Have the light of reason. Reason is not opposed to spiritual consciousness. This is one of the great underlying thought of Aurobindo's Life Divine. Reason and intuition are not opposed to each other. What is highest spiritually knowable reality is also intellectually inevitable conclusion. And therefore, Aurobindo says, apply your reason thoroughly. Don't stop in the middle. Intellectuality should be led to the highest point. So, be guided by the light of reason. And if reason says there are higher modes of knowledge, open to them. There are if you examine the human possibilities, you do find that human mind does get flashes. There are illuminations. Don't reject them outside. Don't say we refuse to believe that there are higher ways of knowing. How can you refuse? They are there. So, if in your northern minds, northern regions, higher regions, if there are northern lights coming into you, don't refuse them. Go ahead and don't fear to aspire. If you are aspiring for God, light, freedom and immortality, which mankind has always done, and even with this present pragmatists and others are saying don't, do not be deluded by these half thoughts, half-baked thoughts. Do not fear to aspire. Continue this aspiration. The evolution demands it, the highest reason demands it, the highest intuition demands it. You have the mind. Aurobindo says, use the highest splendors of the mind. Use these highest splendors of the mind as gates so that you will arrive at the resting place. There is a resting place where your aspirations are fulfilled. You can reach them. I think there is a strip of the film, no? There is a strip of northern lights. You know, it's an astronomical... It's an astronomical strip. Because Aurobindo uses the word these northern lights, I refer to that what is called aurora borealis. Now, this aurora borealis happens in the Arctic region at night. So, if you are in the night of darkness, and in that darkness also sometimes light comes, be sure there is a greater light. And therefore, take it as a sign. What Aurobindo speaks of northern lights in the astronomical world, which are due to the sunlight. Similarly, whatever intuitions we are receiving are because of the supramental sun. And it is supramental sun which sends down so many intuitions. So Aurobindo says that if you see northern lights, imagine there is still a greater light, the real source, the sun. Similarly, you see these intuitions which come to you, they reveal that there is still a greater sun, and that is the real source of all the intuitions which are coming. So do not merely throw away the intuitions. Go by the light of the northern lights and try to reach the supramental light. This is the whole idea. With the end of the first chapter, we might say that half the work is done. And if I aim at doing the first 7 chapters, then I should cover the remaining 6 chapters as quickly as possible. But maybe that we shall not be able to cover all the 6 chapters. At least the first 4 chapters I would like to temporarily aim at. The next 3 chapters are devoted to an exposition of the main line of the dialectic. We have seen that the affirmation of divine life, in which the Supreme Consciousness can manifest in human body or a physical body, has been affirmed. Now this affirmation requires to be reaffirmed. The reason being that in the first sweep the basic argument is laid down, but there is a need for a detailed argument, and there has to be a larger sweep of human thought. And this is what Aurobindo attempts in the next chapters. If you read the first 2 paragraphs of the second chapter, Aurobindo lays down a kind of a theorem. These 2 paragraphs are a statement of a theorem. The divine life in a physical body implies that human body is to be a fit robe of the spirit. And that in order that this proposition is firmly established, we need to relate spirit and matter. Now this question of relating spirit and matter has been a principal occupation of a number of philosophical systems. The distance between spirit and matter is so great that one would be quite justified in saying that the two are quite opposite of each other. Spirit is conscious, matter is unconscious. Spirit is most sensitive, matter is most insensitive. Spirit is incorruptible, matter is constantly corruptible. And this contrast being so great, it is very difficult to think of matter being a right vehicle for spiritual manifestation. And if, however, that statement is affirmed, we need to plow through a difficult terrain. We have to show that spirit and matter are not only not opposed to each other, but as the Upanishad said, matter is itself Brahman, Annam Brahma. So that you can even say that spirit and matter are one. But again, spirit and matter are not only opposed to each other, but they seem to be very distant from each other. Even in our ordinary experience, we find that between matter and spirit, there is in between, there is life, there is mind, and then beyond mind is a spirit. This is to say the least, because even between matter and life there are many domains. Between life and mind there are many domains. And between the mind and supermind there are many domains. And then supermind and the spirit, supreme spirit. So the distances between the matter and spirit are so great that unless we can link them all together and say, matter is life, life is mind, mind is supermind, supermind is spirit, unless we can show these identities, it is very difficult to convince the intellect of man that there can be a divine body, a spiritualized body, in which the supreme consciousness of the spirit can manifest comprehensively and omnipotently. This is the theorem that we are obliged to show that matter and spirit are one, and that between matter and spirit there are many intermediaries, and that there is a complete link among all of them. In fact, it is this large sweep that brings all the physical and psychological facts into picture. And you can see that, actually speaking, the entire first volume is to show this linkage. Particularly from chapter number 9, which analyzes the spirit and speaks of three terms of the spirit, Sat, Chit and Ananda. So chapter number 9 deals with Sat. Chapter number 10 deals with Chit. And chapter number 11 and 12 deal with Ananda. So Sat, Chit, Ananda, there are 4 chapters devoted to that. Then there is a transition from supermind towards matter. That is to say, from spirit to matter, the link is a supermind. Therefore, supermind, chapter number 13, 4 chapters are given only to supermind, because that is the main thesis of the whole book, that there is a supramental consciousness, and this supramental consciousness is a link. It is not the supreme consciousness, it is the link of consciousness. It is a consciousness of Satchidananda.